If you've ever dealt with a crazy HOA, you know how maddening it can be to follow 1,000 rules that seem to serve no purpose other than to make your life difficult. But what do you do when the HOA president, aka the neighborhood Karen, decides to take things to a whole new level? Well, let me tell you, I found the perfect way to get back at her. And let's just say I made my point with 1,000 pounds of trash. If you're like me, you probably thought an HOA was just a harmless group of neighborhood volunteers making sure everyone's lawn is mowed and the trash cans are tucked away. But, oh no, that's not how it goes in my neighborhood. I didn't sign up for this chaos. Let me introduce you to Karen, the woman who took that tiny bit of neighborhood control and twisted it into a full-blown reign of terror. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. As president, she believed that every minor detail of the neighborhood was her responsibility. Things as small as the shade of blue your front door should be, or how often you need to trim your bushes. If it wasn't up to her standards, she'd find a way to make sure you knew. I swear, if there was a speck of dirt on your driveway, Karen would be the first to point it out, as if you just committed a felony. But, of course, it was never personal. It was always about the rules. She'd tell you that it was for the good of the neighborhood. But we all knew it was really about her need to control everything. One morning, as I was taking my trash out, I realized just how deep her obsession went. This was the day Karen took my trash can. Now, I know it sounds ridiculous. Why would anyone care about a trash can? You might be thinking. Well, in Karen's world, it wasn't about the trash can. It was about control. Our neighborhood had this very specific rule. Your trash can had to be neatly hidden behind the fence and should only be put out on the curb at the exact right time. Apparently, I didn't follow this rule to her liking, and Karen, being the dedicated HOA president that she was, decided it was her duty to take my trash can. You're probably wondering how that could even happen. It's just a trash can, right? But when you live under the rule of a petty HOA, things like this can spiral. I came home to find my trash can gone, and a note on my door from Karen saying, "Please follow HOA rules and keep your garbage in its designated place." First, I tried to stay calm. I tried to reason with her, to explain that I just didn't think it was a big deal. But, of course, Karen didn't want to listen. She was the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, a position she took very seriously. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. It wasn't really about the trash can at all. It was about the power trip. She was using something as small as a trash bin to remind everyone who was in charge. And that's when it hit me. Maybe it was time to remind Karen who was in charge in my life. The thought of her constantly dictating every little thing in my neighborhood made my blood boil. So I decided to get my trash can back. But I wasn't going to do it the polite way. No, I was going to give her a taste of her own medicine. In fact, I was going to dump 1,000 pounds of garbage on her pristine lawn. Now, I know it sounds over the top, but if you've ever dealt with a Karen-like HOA president, you'll understand the level of frustration. The feeling of being constantly controlled for no good reason can push anyone to the edge. So, after that trash can fiasco, I just couldn't sit back anymore. It was time to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. As ridiculous as it might sound, that trash can represented the absurd control Karen thought she had over my life. And I was about to turn it into something much bigger and messier than she ever could have imagined. It all started with a simple idea. Live in a peaceful neighborhood, enjoy the suburban life, and take advantage of all the amenities offered. I had no clue that signing up for a new home in a neighborhood governed by an HOA, homeowners association, would quickly turn into a nightmare. First, everything seemed fine. The homes were nice, the streets were clean, and there was an overall sense of orderliness. But that peace didn't last long. I remember my first interaction with the HOA like it was yesterday. I had just moved in, settled into my new place, and was still unpacking boxes when a small white envelope appeared in my mailbox. It looked official, too official. I tore it open and found a letter from the HOA board. The letter didn't say, "Welcome to the neighborhood," or even offer any helpful advice. Instead, it was a warning about my front lawn. Apparently, my grass was just a little too long. I blinked. I had literally just mowed it the day before. But there it was, another regulation that I had apparently violated without knowing. Please ensure your lawn is maintained to the HOA standard of 2.5 inches. or will be forced to take corrective action. The letter read, "Corrective action? Over grass?" This was just the beginning. First, I thought it was a mistake. Surely they couldn't be that strict about the length of grass. But soon enough, the letters kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. My car, yes, my parked car, was a few inches out of alignment with the others. No, I hadn't noticed it, but there was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, driving by every morning with her eagle eyes, watching everyone like a hawk. She was the one behind the complaints, no doubt. If it wasn't the grass, it was the alignment of my car. If it wasn't the car, it was something else. The mailbox wasn't the approved color, or my fence had a slight chip that needed fixing. Every time I turned around, there was another fine or warning on my doorstep. Each letter came with an instruction on how I could correct the violation, usually at my own expense. A small fee to help with maintenance costs. To cover the expenses of having an HOA officer watch my every move. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just typical bureaucracy, but then came the day I would learn just how far these people would go to make life miserable. It started with a simple issue, my trash can. It was one of those basic, no-frills trash bins, the kind everyone uses. I put it out on trash day just like every other house on the block. But apparently, I made a rookie mistake by not following the sacred trash can rules. According to the HOA, all trash cans were to be placed at least 6 feet from the curb, and the lids had to be closed perfectly. 6 feet? Who measures that? But no, apparently that was a serious breach of HOA conduct. The next thing I knew, Karen showed up at my door, looking even more self-righteous than usual. She was holding my trash can, the very one I had left by the curb the night before. She didn't knock or ring the doorbell. She simply stared at me, as if I had committed a crime against humanity. "This doesn't meet HOA standards," she said, as if this was the most serious issue in the world. "You left the can too close to the curb. I've confiscated it." She walked away with my trash can like she had just confiscated contraband. "You'll get it back once it meets the proper guidelines," she added, without any shred of remorse. I stood there, stunned. My trash can, the one I had used for years without issue, was gone. No warning, no discussion, just Karen, deciding that she had the right to take something that belonged to me for no reason at all. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but I knew it would be futile. There was no reasoning with Karen, and the HOA had already made it clear that their rules were set in stone. I tried calling the HOA office to get some clarity, but all I received was a polite, condescending response that didn't address the actual issue. They told me that Karen had acted within her authority and that if I wanted my trash can back, I needed to follow the exact specifications outlined by the HOA. They even said they'd send an official inspector to make sure my trash can was up to code before returning it to me. Couldn't believe it. My trash can had been taken like a criminal's belongings. And the worst part? I couldn't even figure out what I had done wrong. I thought I had followed the rules. I had done what was expected, but Karen's idea of rules was far stricter than any human logic would allow. That was the moment I realized just how much power these HOA people wielded. I was just another number on a list, another resident to keep in line. And Karen, with her perfect house, perfect lawn, and perfect life, was the one with the power to control it all. Her authority felt endless. I had a choice. Either conform to every ridiculous rule, or face a constant stream of petty infractions. It was exhausting. The worst part was dealing with the HOA's bureaucracy. Every time I had an issue, I had to jump through hoops just to get an answer. There was no one to talk to, no clear answers, no human being willing to give a straight response. It was just endless paperwork, endless regulations, and Karen, standing in the background with a smug smile, watching me squirm. I felt trapped. There was no escaping it, no way to win. Every little infraction seemed to spiral into a bigger issue. And all the while, Karen grew bolder, more emboldened by her power. I was just another pawn in her game of neighborhood dominance. But little did she know, the frustration was building, and sooner or later, it would all come to a head. I had no idea that retrieving my trash can would be the start of a saga that would change the entire vibe of the neighborhood. What I thought would be a simple call to the HOA turned into an exhausting series of phone calls, false promises, and an unshakable feeling that Karen was out to get me. It all started when I called the HOA office. At first, I figured I'd just give them a ring, explain the situation, and get my trash can back without much hassle. Little did I know, I was walking into a bureaucratic nightmare that would have made even the most patient person lose their mind. I dialed the number listed on the HOA letter, hoping for some common sense. A woman picked up after a few rings, clearly in a hurry. I introduced myself and explained the situation, mentioning that my trash can had been taken by Karen for apparently violating some obscure rule I had never heard of. "Oh, I see," she said, not even sounding surprised. "Well, we have strict standards, and it's likely your trash bin doesn't meet them." She didn't even ask for details, didn't inquire about the specifics of the trash can, just assumed I was in the wrong. I tried to ask for clarification on the so-called standards she was referring to, but she was dismissive, brushing it off as if it wasn't important. "I can't really help you over the phone. You'll have to speak with Karen. She handles all the trash-related issues," the woman added, sounding more like she was passing the buck than offering a solution. Of course, I knew what that meant. Karen was the one who had stolen my trash can in the first place. I tried to keep calm, asking her if there was another way to resolve it. She just repeated, "Call Karen. She's the one who's handling it." And with that, she hung up. I was left staring at the phone, more frustrated than before. I didn't waste any time. I immediately called Karen's number. It rang and rang until finally, she picked up with a voice that could only be described as smug. "What's the issue now?" she asked, her tone dripping with superiority. She knew exactly what I was going to say, and it was clear she was relishing in it. "Karen, my trash can was taken. I was told it didn't meet HOA standards. Can you please explain what the issue is?" I asked, trying my best to sound polite, though I could feel my patience wearing thin. "Let me guess, you're upset because your trash can doesn't match the HOA-approved model, right?" she responded, barely hiding the satisfaction in her voice. "Well, that's your problem. It's not up to standard. You'll have to buy a new one." My eyes nearly popped out of my head. "Buy a new one? Karen, it's a trash can. What in the world do you mean, buy a new one?" I asked, barely able to contain my disbelief. She just laughed. "Oh, honey, the HOA requires specific bins for aesthetic reasons. You can't just have anything sitting out there. You should have read the guidelines before you started leaving your trash out like that." She didn't care that it was a standard run-of-the-mill trash can. To her, it was an offense against the perfect appearance of the neighborhood. I tried to keep my cool. "Can you at least return the one you took? It's just sitting in your yard," I pleaded, hoping for some common sense. But Karen wasn't interested in reasoning. "You'll have to follow the rules," she snapped. "And until you get one that meets standards, I'm afraid I can't return it. The HOA will deal with it." With that, she hung up on me, leaving me speechless. I was left standing in my driveway, feeling like an idiot for even trying. But I wasn't done yet. No, I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I did some digging, reaching out to a few of my neighbors to see if they had any similar run-ins with Karen and her rules. To my shock, it wasn't just me. Other neighbors had faced her wrath for the smallest of things. One had been fined because their trash cans weren't lined up in the right direction. Another neighbor had to repaint their fence because Karen claimed the shade of brown was too dull for the HOA's standards. It became clear to me that this wasn't just about the trash can. This was about Karen enjoying her power and using it to control everything in the neighborhood, no matter how ridiculous. One of the neighbors even told me that Karen had once forced them to trim their hedges every 2 weeks, despite the fact that their yard was perfectly well kept. "She just loves finding something to complain about," they explained, rolling their eyes. "She's always watching, waiting for an excuse to report you." That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She wasn't even being the good neighbor that the HOA claimed to want. No, Karen was out to make life harder for everyone, and she got some sick satisfaction from it. I realized then that getting my trash can back wasn't the real issue. The problem was Karen herself. The way she thrived on making people feel small, insignificant, and frustrated. And that's when I made up my mind. If the HOA wasn't going to stand up to her, maybe it was time for me to do something about it. But first, I had to deal with this trash can. And I wasn't going to let it go. Not anymore. I sat there in my living room, staring out the window at Karen's house. The HOA had always been a pain, but after what she did with my trash can, taking it without warning or reason, I couldn't just let it slide. I mean, who does that? Who thinks it's okay to take someone's property and act like it's no big deal? It wasn't just the trash can. It was the principle of the thing. This Karen wasn't just some petty neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. So there I was, stewing in my frustration, imagining all sorts of ways I could get back at her. Revenge. Sweet, sweet revenge. But what's the best way to get even with a Karen? Not just any Karen, mind you, but the HOA Karen who thinks she can control everyone's lives. What would be satisfying enough to make her regret crossing me? What would give her the lesson she deserved without making me the villain? The first idea was, well, a little too direct. I could just march right over to her house, knock on her door, and demand she give my trash can back. But I quickly discarded that plan. No, Karen wasn't the type to be swayed by direct confrontation. In fact, she probably would have enjoyed it, smiling smugly as I stood there pleading, thinking she had the upper hand. I needed something with more finesse, something she'd never see coming. Then I thought, what if I just stole her trash can? It was a funny idea at first, and in my anger, I could almost picture it. Her walking outside the next morning, expecting to see her perfectly aligned trash can in front of her garage, only to find it missing. But then it hit me, if I took her trash can, I'd be lowering myself to her level. Plus, she could always report it to the HOA, and they'd probably just side with her anyway. No, I needed something bigger. Something that would make her realize she'd messed with the wrong person. After a bit more thinking, I came up with another idea. I could prank her in some bizarre, embarrassing way. Maybe put up fake yard sale signs around her house. Or leave an anonymous note telling her she had the worst-kept lawn in the neighborhood. It would be petty, and it would make her angry, but honestly, it didn't feel satisfying enough. What's the point of a prank if it's not going to make someone completely lose their mind? And Karen wasn't the type to lose her mind over something like that. She'd probably just laugh it off, knowing she had the power to get back at me in her own way. No, this wouldn't work either. But then, the perfect idea hit me. It was so simple, so obvious. And yet, I hadn't thought of it until then. I'd dump garbage all over her lawn. I could just imagine it. A massive pile of trash right on her perfectly manicured front yard. It was poetic, really. A true lesson in karma. She thought she could take my trash can, treat me like I was nothing, so why not return the favor? I wasn't just going to leave a little bag of garbage. No, I was going all out. I was talking about 1,000 pounds of trash. I was talking about a garbage heap that would make her regret ever messing with me. I started thinking about how I could pull this off. I didn't want it to look like a random act of mischief. No, I needed it to be personal. This had to be calculated, perfect. First, I needed to find a way to gather the trash. I could go around my neighborhood, sneaking into people's bins under the cover of night, and start collecting whatever junk I could find. But that wasn't nearly enough. No, I needed a bigger supply. So, I started asking myself, where can I get a ton of trash without raising any suspicion? And then, it occurred to me, the local dumpster. There was a commercial dumpster behind the shopping center. One that was always full of old food packaging, broken items, and who knows what else. Perfect. I could load up a few bags from there, and no one would notice. I could also ask a few neighbors who were just as fed up with Karen's HOA antics if they wanted to join in. The thought of them helping me out made it even sweeter. I wasn't alone in my quest for justice. Next, I needed to think about the timing. I didn't want to do this during the day when she'd be home or when the HOA patrols might be around. No, this had to be under the cover of darkness when everyone was asleep and the streets were quiet. The last thing I needed was to get caught. So, I set the date, Friday night. I figured everyone would be too busy with their weekend plans to notice anything odd happening. The perfect cover. Then, I had to figure out how to actually get all this trash onto her lawn without making it look like a random act of dumping. I wanted it to be strategic so that when she stepped outside the next morning, she'd be hit with the full force of my revenge. I decided to spread the garbage out like a huge, sprawling mess. Maybe even put a few things that belonged to her in there, like some of the flyers she'd sent around, or a note about how her reign as HOA queen was officially over. I wanted it to be a statement. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. The night before the big dump, I had everything in place. I had my bags of trash, my route mapped out, and my backup plan in case things went awry. I'd make sure to get out of there as quickly as possible and leave no trace. No fingerprints, no sign of who had done it. Just a mountain of garbage, sitting there for her to deal with. As I was getting ready to execute my perfect plan, I thought about how satisfying it would be to see Karen's face the next morning when she discovered what had happened. She thought she could mess with me, take my trash can, and make my life a little more miserable. But now it was my turn to remind her what happens when you mess with the wrong person. I was ready. It was time to dump 1,000 pounds of garbage on Karen's front lawn. It was poetic, it was sweet, and best of all, it was the perfect revenge. The idea had been simmering in my mind for days. I knew I had to do something epic, something that would make Karen understand exactly how petty her actions were. My brain started working overtime, thinking of every possible way to make her life as miserable as she'd made mine. And then it hit me. If she wanted to take my trash can, I'd give her something far worse. An absolute mountain of trash, right in her pristine front yard. The plan started to take shape the moment I began thinking about the logistics. It wasn't just about gathering trash. It was about making a statement, a bold one that Karen couldn't ignore. First, I needed to gather materials. And not just any trash, this had to be enormous. No half measures here. I started with my own house. After all, what could be better than using the trash I had already accumulated? I went out to the alley behind my house and looked through the overflowing bins. Old pizza boxes, broken appliances, some lawn clippings. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. For the scale of revenge I was planning, I needed more. I needed volume. The next step? My neighbors. Luckily, I had already spent enough time talking to a few of them to know they were just as fed up with Karen as I was. One neighbor, an older guy named Jerry, had been getting his own share of complaints from her. His grass was too long, his driveway too cracked. Jerry was all in when I pitched the idea. "You're telling me we get back at that witch and all I have to do is dump some trash?" He laughed. "Count me in." The planning continued. I went door to door, discreetly asking around. Some neighbors were hesitant at first, mostly the ones who didn't want to get involved, but when I mentioned how much I hated the idea of Karen pushing me around, a few others jumped at the chance to help. Jerry was already throwing bags of trash into my trunk when I pulled up, laughing about how this was the best form of therapy. But I wasn't done yet. I needed more. So, I drove to a few local events, a nearby construction site, a couple of festivals, a few places where trash had piled up after big community gatherings. It wasn't hard to find dumpsters with plenty of discarded food wrappers, broken chairs, and who knows what else. As I loaded my car, I felt like a secret agent on a mission, with every new bag of garbage adding to my satisfaction. Then came the most crucial part: timing. I couldn't just dump the trash during the day. That would be too obvious. The last thing I wanted was for Karen to spot me or, worse, get caught on one of the neighborhood security cameras. I had to pick the perfect time: nighttime. It was a few days before I finally got everything ready. I sat by my window, watching the sunset, waiting for Karen's lights to turn off. She usually went to bed early. Her whole life seemed scheduled down to the minute, a tight routine that she believed was the key to her control over the neighborhood. But that meant it was perfect for me. Around midnight, her porch lights flickered off. That was my signal. I grabbed the last of the bags from my car, checked that I had the right tools, nothing too crazy. Just gloves, a shovel for extra reach, and a few big tarps to help cover the trash if I needed to, and made my way to her house. The street was eerily quiet, but that was exactly how I liked it. I avoided the main roads, going down the back alleys to stay out of sight of any potential HOA patrols or neighbors who might be out for late-night walks. The only sound was the rustling of the trash bags as I walked toward Karen's perfectly manicured lawn. Her house looked like something out of a magazine. Tidy, precise, nothing out of place. But tonight, it was about to be completely and utterly ruined. I started unloading the trash, careful not to make too much noise. A broken couch, stacks of dirty cardboard, discarded food containers from the festival. It all went into her yard, one piece at a time. I made sure to spread it out, creating a mountain of garbage that would take her hours to clean up. By the time I was done, the entire front yard was completely covered. You couldn't even see her beautiful flower beds anymore. Just trash. The best part? I made sure I left a little something on her driveway, just to make sure she'd step in it first thing in the morning. A pile of old, soggy leftover food, because if there was one thing Karen loved more than rules, it was keeping her driveway spotless. Now, her perfect little world was about to fall apart. I stood back, admiring my work. It was glorious. I made a hasty retreat, disappearing into the darkness of the neighborhood, heart racing from the rush of the job well done. The next morning was going to be something else entirely. I woke up to a flurry of text messages from neighbors, all of them speculating on what had happened. One even sent a picture. Karen's yard was literally unrecognizable. She had come out in her usual morning routine, probably hoping to check on her lawn's perfect symmetry. But instead, she was greeted with the overwhelming smell of rotting food and an avalanche of trash in her front yard. It didn't take long for the first scream to echo through the neighborhood. Her shrill voice could be heard all the way from my window, yelling in disbelief. Who did this? Who's responsible for this? I had to bite my lip to stop from laughing. The whole neighborhood was waking up to Karen's meltdown. As her high-pitched rants continued, I couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction. It was the kind of satisfaction you get when you know you've taken control of your own life after someone else tries to push you around. It wasn't just about the trash. It was about standing up to the petty authority she thought she had over everyone. What made it even better was that some of the neighbors, those who had been silently rooting for me from the start, couldn't contain their amusement. They watched her freak out from their windows, some even filming her outrage in secret, knowing that one day, it would be part of the neighborhood's legend. I could almost hear the whispers of approval. She had it coming. By the time Karen's hysteria reached its peak, more and more neighbors were quietly cheering. Some from behind their curtains, others giving me knowing nods when we crossed paths later that day. I could practically feel the collective sense of justice in the air. It was as if everyone else had been waiting for someone to finally put Karen in her place, and I had delivered. In the end, Karen spent the entire day trying to clean up the mess, cursing me, the neighbors, and anyone she could think of. But the damage was done. The HOA didn't even bother to help her. It was clear that this was her mess to deal with, and I was more than content watching from the sidelines, knowing that she'd never forget the lesson that sometimes you don't mess with the wrong people. The following morning, after I'd carried out my revenge, I could already sense something was off. The sweet, quiet stillness of the neighborhood seemed oddly tense. It wasn't long before the neighborhood became a buzz of whispers. My phone started blowing up with texts from neighbors, some in disbelief, others barely holding back their laughter. The real show, however, was about to begin. Around noon, I got a call from Karen herself. Her voice, high-pitched and shaking, was practically screaming through the phone. "I know it was you. You are the only person bold enough to do something like this," she shrieked, and I could almost feel her red face on the other end. "I demand you clean up this mess immediately, or I will report you to the HOA. I held back the urge to laugh and decided to play it cool. "What mess?" I asked, feigning confusion. "You don't even have the decency to deny it," Karen continued, her voice now a mix of fury and frustration. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable. You think this is funny? You've disrupted the entire neighborhood's peace." I could hear her pacing around in her house, no doubt clutching the phone like a weapon. But what could she actually do? There was no way to prove it was me, no security footage, no witnesses. "I'm sorry, Karen," I said, maintaining my innocent tone. "But I've been home all day, just taking care of things. I haven't touched anything outside my house." She paused, trying to search for any piece of evidence that would tie me to the incident. But of course, there was nothing. The more she tried to dig, the more frustrated she became. "I'm calling the HOA right now," she fumed. "You're going to regret this. Just wait." I hung up, feeling a strange satisfaction. Karen had no proof and I had made sure of that. It was just a waiting game now. I didn't expect her to just let it go, though. After all, she was the kind of person who believed every small inconvenience was an act of war. And this? Well, this was war. Sure enough, about an hour later, I received another call. This time from the HOA. "Hello? Is this your name?" The voice on the other end asked, its tone colder than I was expecting. I could already tell this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Yes, speaking," I replied, trying to sound casual. "We've received a complaint from Karen, and we've been informed that you may be responsible for the recent incident involving the trash on her lawn." I chuckled inwardly but kept my tone neutral. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. I was home all day yesterday, and my trash can was just where it always is. Maybe there's been some misunderstanding." The person on the other end cleared their throat, clearly not buying it. "Well, we are taking the matter seriously. The neighborhood has been disrupted, and the HOA board needs to address this issue immediately. We will be launching an investigation." I just nodded, knowing that I could play the innocent card for as long as I needed. The HOA had no evidence either. They couldn't pin anything on me. I could already tell they were grasping at straws. The HOA had a history of being overzealous with rules and regulations, but they also had a tendency to crumble under pressure, especially when it came to dealing with more serious issues. That's when Karen really went into full Karen mode. Over the next few days, she harassed everyone she could: neighbors, the HOA board, even the mailman, trying to get them on her side. She was relentless. She would show up at people's doors, calling them out for not standing up against the vandalism in the neighborhood. In typical Karen fashion, she acted like this was the worst thing to ever happen to the community, and she just couldn't let it slide. Meanwhile, I sat back and watched, amused, as the HOA tried to find a scapegoat. I had made sure that there was no trace of me or anything connecting me to the trash disaster. No fingerprints, no evidence of my involvement. Karen's outrage wasn't backed by anything solid. And then something unexpected happened. As Karen continued her tirade, murmurs started circulating among the other HOA members. It wasn't long before people began questioning Karen's leadership. Some of the neighbors who had been frustrated with her dictatorial approach started to take note of her overreaction. "Karen's always been a little much, but this is ridiculous," one of the neighbors muttered at a community event. "I swear, it's like she's obsessed with the smallest things. This whole trash can incident. She's making it sound like we're under attack or something," another neighbor remarked, shaking their head. The whispers spread quickly, and within a few days, a couple of other HOA board members had their doubts. They were beginning to wonder if Karen was exaggerating the situation. Some residents had begun questioning her leadership style before, but now, with the whole trash drama, it was becoming obvious. People were sick of her petty demands. A few board members even quietly approached me, expressing their frustration with Karen and her leadership. They had seen how she handled every complaint, no matter how trivial, with an iron fist. One of them, a woman named Susan, even apologized on behalf of the HOA, hinting that she would support me if things escalated. "I can't stand the way Karen treats people," she said quietly. "You didn't deserve this, and I can't imagine she'll let this go until she gets someone to blame. But just know, you have more support in this neighborhood than she realizes." I thanked Susan and told her to keep me updated. It was becoming clear that Karen was starting to lose her grip on the HOA, and as her grip loosened, I felt more confident in my position. The HOA board had a meeting scheduled to discuss the incident, and I was curious to see how it would play out. On one hand, I knew Karen would be pushing hard for some kind of punishment. On the other hand, the longer this dragged on, the more people would begin to see Karen for what she truly was: a petty, vindictive leader with nothing to show for it except anger and empty complaints. As Karen's influence started to wane, I could see the endgame coming into view. The HOA would have no choice but to address her behavior. And when they did, I'd be there, quietly watching, knowing that I had successfully turned the tables. And what a satisfying turn it was. After the great trash incident, Karen's reign of terror started to unravel faster than she could have imagined. What was once a quiet neighborhood, plagued by her constant nitpicking and petty demands, now had a spark of rebellion in the air. Word of the trash dump quickly spread like wildfire. Neighbors, who had long been afraid to speak out, suddenly felt empowered by the chaos she had caused. It wasn't long before more complaints started piling up against Karen. At first, it was the usual minor issues. Someone's lawn was too wild, or another person's mailbox wasn't in the right place. But soon, those complaints turned into serious ones. People who had previously tolerated Karen's presence now started writing formal grievances. They complained about how she harassed them over trivial things, how she bullied neighbors into following impossible rules, and how she seemed to have nothing better to do than control everyone else's lives. It was clear that Karen had crossed the line from quirky HOA enforcer to a full-on neighborhood tyrant. As the complaints grew louder, the HOA had no choice but to address the situation. They couldn't ignore the uproar any longer, especially after the infamous trash incident, which had become the talk of the entire block. But Karen, ever the delusional optimist, still believed she was untouchable. She clung to her position like a lifeline, convinced that her actions were justified and that she had every right to control everything. That's when something unexpected happened. A group of neighbors who had been quietly suffering under Karen's rule decided they'd had enough. They got together, united by their mutual frustration and resentment of her. They knew that if they wanted to rid the neighborhood of her, they had to act fast. So, they gathered signatures for a petition, calling for Karen's removal from her position as HOA president. It wasn't just about the trash can anymore. It was about reclaiming their neighborhood from a person who had gone too far. The petition spread quickly through the neighborhood, and it was backed by everyone from the young family next door to the retired couple who had been living there for years. Even those who had once feared Karen's power now spoke up. They shared stories of how she had made their lives miserable, and slowly but surely the petition gained traction. The people who had been hesitant before now joined in with enthusiasm, their voices growing stronger and more unified. The HOA, initially hesitant to take action against one of their own, could no longer ignore the mounting pressure. The board members, who had once cowered under Karen's authority, began to see her for what she truly was, a tyrant who had turned the community into a battlefield. With enough signatures in hand, they called an emergency vote to decide Karen's fate. When the day of the vote finally came, the tension was palpable. Everyone gathered, waiting for the verdict. Karen, still blissfully unaware of the growing storm against her, showed up with her usual smug confidence. But as the board members cast their votes, something remarkable happened. The support for Karen had completely eroded. The votes were tallied, and Karen was out. Just like that, the woman who had ruled with an iron fist was no longer part of the HOA. The decision was final, and she had no choice but to accept it. The news hit Karen like a ton of bricks. She couldn't believe it. For the first time, she was powerless. The once feared HOA president was now nothing more than a resident of the neighborhood, no different from anyone else. Her power had evaporated, and with it, so had her sense of control. It wasn't long before she decided it was time to pack up and leave. With nowhere to turn, Karen sold her house and moved out of the neighborhood. For the rest of us, the sense of victory was sweet. No longer would we have to deal with her constant interference. No longer would we be at the mercy of her whims and petty demands. But perhaps the most satisfying part of it all was the return of my trash can. After everything, I had gotten back what was rightfully mine. A simple, everyday item that symbolized so much more than just a trash receptacle. It was a symbol of reclaiming my space, my peace, and my dignity. Karen may have moved out, but the joy of knowing she could no longer control our lives lingered. The neighborhood was free again, and while the trash incident might have been the catalyst for her downfall, it was the unity of the community, the strength of the people who stood up against her, that truly sealed her fate. The sweet feeling of justice finally arrived, not just in the form of my trash can but in the form of a neighborhood that was no longer under the thumb of an overzealous HOA president. Karen got what she deserved, and we got our peace back. At the end of the day, Dealing with an HOA can feel like being trapped in a maze of rules, regulations, and power struggles that have nothing to do with maintaining a peaceful community. These associations often start with the best of intentions, ensuring uniformity and order in residential areas. But before long, they evolve into something much less noble, a place where power-hungry individuals, like Karen, thrive. They start to see themselves as the enforcers of a self-made kingdom, using their position to dictate every little detail about how people should live, down to the color of their trash cans. It's funny how quickly these rules can start to feel like they serve the interests of a few rather than the needs of everyone. Suddenly, what was once a small, helpful structure for maintaining neighborhood standards turns into a tyranny of minor restrictions that can drive you insane. How is it possible that something as trivial as where you put your trash could become a point of conflict? Or that your front yard could be under constant surveillance for minor violations that don't impact anyone else? But that's exactly what happens when power gets into the wrong hands. People like Karen, with their overinflated sense of authority, are more than happy to make mountains out of molehills. They are so caught up in their own need to control everything around them that they forget what it really means to be a good neighbor. Instead of fostering a sense of community, they create tension and resentment. And, as it often happens, that resentment builds up until someone finally decides they've had enough. I know I'm not the only one who's been on the receiving end of these ridiculous HOA policies. Many of us have had to navigate a world where petty rules become a constant source of frustration. Whether it's being fined for the wrong lawn ornament or getting a warning because your car is parked an inch out of line, it's easy to see how quickly these small issues escalate into a major problem. That's the thing about power, it starts small but can easily snowball into something much bigger than it ever should have been. This experience taught me an important lesson. Don't let anyone with a badge and a clipboard make you feel powerless. There's always a way to stand up for yourself, even if it means getting a little creative with your approach. I could have simply accepted Karen's demands and lived with the inconvenience of having my trash can stolen, but that would have let her win. Instead, I chose to take matters into my own hands and send a clear message. I won't be controlled by petty tyrants. But it's not just about revenge. It's about standing up to what's unfair and not letting the small stuff slide. Because, if we all quietly accept the ridiculousness of these rules and never speak out, then the power dynamics only continue to shift in the wrong direction. Eventually, everyone becomes afraid to challenge what's wrong, and those in charge gain even more power. So, if you find yourself dealing with an HOA or any other authority figure who seems more interested in exercising control than fostering community, remember, you have a voice. And more importantly, you have the right to use it. Sometimes that means challenging the system in ways that may seem a bit unconventional. But if it brings justice and puts those who abuse their power in their place, then maybe it's worth it. In the end, Karen learned a lesson that day. The trash can might have been in her hands for a moment, but the real power rests with those who stand up and refuse to be bullied. And now, as I look at my trash can sitting right where it belongs, outside my house, safe and sound, I can smile knowing that I took back control, not just over my trash can, but over my dignity. At least now, my trash can is exactly where it belongs, in front of my house, and not in Karen's power-hungry hands.